I'd like now to introduce our last set of presenters on child and elderly care in South Korea, policy analysis with a gendered, care-focused, computable general equilibrium model. This will be presented by both Hans Lofgren and Martín Cicowiez.
Okay, so I'm trying to share my screen here. Do you see a big screen now? Okay, so thank you very much. I assume that you are hearing me. So Martin and I will present some analysis we did on care in Korea using a computable general equilibrium model. I will talk a little bit about the context and the method and the data, and Martin will talk about the analysis, its results, and summarize what we have arrived at. First of all, to provide some context, and I would like to emphasize that our presentation is really complementary to the previous two presentations, in the sense that we bring the kind of data on the economy and on the in general and on the care economy, on time use, into an economic model. Now, the context is that in Korea, as was mentioned, the total fertility rate is the world's lowest, and the long-term trend, or trend over the last 20 years, for example, is that it has been declining. As a result of this, we do also have projections that the population of children will be declining, whereas the elderly population will grow quite rapidly. And this is done in a context where Korea, in the labor market, the GDP labor market, has the largest gender wage gap among the OECD countries. Why are we using a computable general equilibrium model? Well, this is a kind of models that make it possible to link the households' production, both in the market and in the household service, including the care economy, to the government and its policy, to international trade. So you get a complete picture of the economy. Our model is highly disaggregated compared to other similar analysis of this kind in terms of its treatment of the care economy, where we consider both elderly and childcare, in terms of the labor force, which is disaggregated by gender and education. So we can look at issues related to female labor force participation in the GDP economy. And we are also addressing issues related to the gendered wage discrimination. And this also makes it possible for us to look at a fairly wide range of social and economic outcomes, both the more typical economic measures of GDP and also non-GDP production, fiscal indicators, as well as time use indicators. And this is not the first model in the tradition of looking at gender in CGE models, but it's the first model that looks at care issues. This figure here shows you a very, very simplified aggregate picture of what we are doing. So we have two kinds of production, one that is part of the GDP sphere, and the other one is part of the household service sphere. And those generate incomes to labor and to other factors. And the incomes are passed on to the households that use this income to be consuming, either out of from the GDP sphere or from the household services, including care. And for the case of when you're talking about the production of, let's say, childcare inside a household, then these incomes become implicit, because it's the household that is providing the production of the service that is also making use of the services for the most part. And there is a role for government policies in influencing what is happening throughout the economy. The main data source is a social accounting matrix for Korea that we built for this analysis. So that's the main data input, and it's the first gender SAM for Korea, and it's the first care-focused SAM in the world. And it's a matrix that has it's a square matrix that has more than 100 accounts. We have 4 labor categories by skill level and by gender. And we have 3 households, and they have been disaggregated on the basis of their different kinds of care needs. So we have a household with a working age head that has children. We have a household type that has a working age head, but they're the families without children. And then we have a third category, which is households with an elderly head. So this means that the households will differ very markedly in terms of what kinds of care needs they have. And it's important to note that in the analysis, households will typically be using that need care services will be using both the services provided by the market and households and services provided by the household itself, or a younger, let's say, a younger household with family links to an elderly household. And the households that use these services, they will then consider what is provided by the market and by the household as imperfect substitutes. So one will not fully replace the other, no matter what happens in the economy. And there are links between transfer links in the model between the households that can provide cash payments and provide time to another household that can be used for care. And there's also the government providing transfers to households and care services. And we have wage discrimination, which is a first. And here, what that means is that women are not the wage received by women does not reflect the marginal value of the output they are producing. So they are discriminated against in terms of the wage that they receive compared to the men. And now I will turn this over to Martín. So I will try to stop stopping my sharing. Let's see here. I'll stop this. Stop share. Okay. So now I leave it over to Martín, and he will do the rest of the presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So I will continue where Hans left. So Hans has described the model that we developed, and here we have the list of the scenarios that we simulate with this model. This is a simulation model, so we have a first scenario that we call the base scenario. It is a dynamic model, so the base scenario goes from 2018, which is the base year of the social accounting matrix, until 2030. In the base scenario, we assume that there are no policy changes. And then we compare this base scenario to 3 different scenarios in this presentation. The first one is an increase in the government spending on childcare. We simulate an increase that is equivalent to 0.15% of GDP. And this is an in-kind transfer of childcare services from the government to the households that have children aged from 0 to 5. And this simulation is designed to address quality concerns about childcare services in Korea. So we basically simulate an increase in the quality of childcare services in Korea. And that is paid by the government, and that is financed by an increase in taxes. The next scenario is similar to the previous one, but in this case, the increase in government spending goes to elderly care. It's the same increase in terms of the amount of money, but this time it goes to elderly care. And it goes to the households that have elderly members. And the last non-based scenario is the one in which we decrease the gender wage gap by 50%, which means that we decrease the discriminatory gender wage gaps. And we basically assume that the gender wage gap in Korea decreases to the average level of the OECD countries, the other OECD countries. So all these shocks are introduced from 2022 to 2030, the last year of the simulations. We use an income tax to finance this increase in spendings. And if you look at the paper, you will find additional scenarios. But here we focus on these 3 scenarios. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the results. I will not be showing all the results, lucky for you, but you have lots of results in the paper. So here we are looking at the hours of paid and unpaid care work in 2030, which again is the last year of the simulation. And here we show the percentage change from the base for males and females. So what we see on the right-hand side is that when government increases the spending on paid care work, on childcare and elderly care, there is an increase on women paid care work that goes from 10% in the amount of time that women work in paid care activities in the childcare scenario, and more than 20% in the elderly care scenario. At the same time, we see a decrease in the time spent by women in unpaid care work. The results for males are similar, but they show like smaller size because female care work is relatively intensive in female work. Sorry, care work is relatively intensive in the use of female workers. Here we show the change in the hours of paid and unpaid work. It's not only care work, it's overall work, both paid and unpaid. And here we also show the change in leisure time. So for women, we see again an increase in paid work, which is GDP work. In the 3 scenarios, when we increase spending in childcare, elderly care, and when we decrease the gender wage gap, at the same time, we see a decrease in unpaid care work, but we also see a decrease in leisure time for women, which means that it's difficult to say if women are better off or not after the increase in their paid work. On the other hand, if we look at the labor income for women in the case of paid work, or the evaluation of their time use, we see that in the first 2 scenarios, and also in the third one, there is an increase in labor income for women. And it is possible to argue that this will have an impact on the bargaining power of women within the households, because now there will be an increase in the contribution of women to the household income. Okay. And that is true, as I said before, in the first 2 scenarios, and also when we decrease the gender wage gap. Okay. Here we look at some like overall results for the care scenarios. What we see is that if we were to focus only on GDP, which is the gray line, and we consider the accumulated impact on GDP, we can see that when we combine the first two scenarios, the increase in GDP is around 1.7%, which means that this would be the increase in GDP, but we have to take into account that the non-GDP side of the economy, which is basically the unpaid work, is going down, but the GDP size is going up. And given the amount of increase in government spending, the number of jobs that will be created in Korea is more than 200,000 jobs. That's what we see here, and this is in line with other estimates for similar countries. Okay. Here we see the results for household consumption, and we compare the results for the elderly household, the household with a working household head with children, and the household with a working household head without children. And what we see here is that there is an increase in the consumption of GDP commodities, and there is a decrease in the consumption of non-GDP commodities in the different scenarios. And it is interesting to notice here is that the working households decrease their unpaid work on elderly care, because now there is a substitution from family paid unpaid care work to paid care work provided by the market. This is what we see here. There is a decrease in the care transfer from one household to the other one. Some concluding remarks. Our simulations show that the policy that address care and wage discrimination, they can make a difference by improving the well-being of households with care responsibilities. And they can also free up time for women so that they can work in jobs that match their education. And we also show that focusing on the GDP part of the economy may lead to misleading results in the sense that increases in GDP, production and consumption might be due to the reallocation from non-GDP sectors. So if we look at the overall economy, the changes are not that large because we are moving from one part of the economy to the other one. Okay. Another thing that it's important to stress is that our results emphasize the trade-off, and they call for policy packages in the sense that increasing the support for child and elderly care from outside the home might increase female work, but they could also lead to a reduced care for children and the elderly. So it's important to consider like policy packages instead of single policy measures. And all that we have shown depends on the assumptions, and some important assumptions are related to the flexibility of the gender roles, both within the households and in the broader labor market. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hans and Martin. You clearly demonstrated the use of the valuation of total unpaid care in the household sector and incorporated in a policy tool such as the Computable General Equilibrium Model, which is used for simulating possible policy impacts. So thank you very much.